All righty. Is that everybody? All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Glad to have you here tonight to study this very, very interesting passage of Scriptures, these chapters in the latter part of the book of Daniel. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this right now. I have literally smoke coming out of my ears trying to figure out chapter 9. So we're going to head into that together, see if we can figure it out. Because there's certain things that make sense, and then different perspectives from people I greatly respect and trying to figure out which one's the right one. You'll see what I mean when we get there. However, what is good is chapter 8 is not too hard to understand. And if you recall, we left off at verse 20, which really makes things quite clear. Now, if you go back to chapter 7, we had a vision there of a bear, right? What was unique about the bear? Lopsided, right? Bigger on one side than the other and had ribs in its mouth, right? Baby backs from Chili's. All right, and then we come forward to the vision of the goat and the ram, and what did we notice about the ram? One horn was larger than the other, right? And so, based on what we understood from chapter 7, bringing that knowledge forward to chapter 8, we made the right assumption that this was representative of, Medo-Persian Empire, where Persia was the dominant. And then in verse 20, to remove any kind of confusion or discrepancies, the ram which you saw with two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat, well, let's go to verse 21. The shaggy goat, what was the unique name we came up with that was in that? You guys remember the goat? He-goat. There you go. Right? Because in this passage over here it says male goat. But Doc Smith prefers he-goat. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, who is? Yeah, Alexander the Great, right? And the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise insolent and skilled in intrigue. And his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. Interesting. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. So, we looked at the first part now, and we're going to now dig into the second part. And so, in verses 15 and 16, I guess we could have backed up a little bit when we were talking about, it came about when I, Daniel, had seen the vision that I sought to understand it. Behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man, and I heard a voice of the man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Right? So now he's dealing individually with Gabriel. So everything that we just saw here was told to him by Gabriel. Verse 19, Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Verse 17, remember we talked about that? Son of man, okay, let's go back. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. And so we were trying to figure out, and it says it again here in verse 19, the end of what? That needs to be the question, because our mind automatically goes to what? Automatically flashes forward to the end of time, the end of all things. But is that what he's writing about here? So let's find out. So we talk about the end of what? Now Daniel was seeking to understand the meaning, page 3 in your notes, where when there stood before him one having the appearance of a man, when a man's voice from the banks of Uli charged Gabriel to make Daniel understand the vision. Now Gabriel speaks to Daniel. He approaches Daniel, prompting Daniel to fall on his face in fear, telling him that the vision refers to the time of the end. So let's talk about this. Time of the end of what? What are the possibilities? So some would say the end of all things. Okay, right. The vision was going to be representative of the end, but the end of what? The captivity? Okay, the end of time in general, end of all things. Okay, could it be the end of Judaism? The end of the Israelite nation? Did it ever come to an end? When? 70 AD. Okay. So do we have any other possibilities that you guys might be thinking about? The end of things. The end, to the end of what? So let's keep these possibilities in our mind and see which one makes the most sense biblically. So Daniel stands on his feet, for Daniel had fallen into a deep sleep with his face to the ground, to tell him what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. There's a key word. For it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So there's some sort of indignation that's going to take place. What do we mean by indignation? Okay, something really terrible that is... It does. Yeah, so it's going to be something really, really bad. Okay, so Gabriel explains the vision. The two-horned ram depicts the kings of Media and Persia. The larger horn may represent Persia's greater influence, and I think that makes the most sense. The expansion of the Medo-Persian Empire illustrated by the ram pushing west and north and south, if you go back to verse 4. Now, the one-horned male goat, or the he-goat, or the shaggy goat, you can call him whatever you want here, depicts the kingdom of Greece. Note that it came from the west. The large horn representing its first king, and we believe this to be Alexander the Great. The speed of the goat aptly reflects Alexander's conquest. If you go back, it was talking about it was moving swiftly. Its feet didn't even touch the ground. Now, Alexander defeated the Persians in 3 decisive battles, and they're listed there for you at the place and the time. Now, if you recall, you see those dates there, 334 through 331. So that time frame that's falling in, what name did we give it? Yeah, the intertestamental period, right? So the time between around 400, 408, or 400s, that intertestamental period, and then the time that Jesus shows up on the scene. So the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place. Alexander died very unexpectedly at the age of 33. His empire was divided between his 4 generals. That's pronounced Ptolemy. Seleucus. Now, Seleucus is important, and that's these are the different kingdoms that they separated out into. So Egypt kind of reestablished itself. Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysicamus. So Macedonia and Greece with Cassander, and Thrace and Asia Minor. So this is what we know from history, and we believe these to be the 4 kings or generals that separated out into their kingdoms, and then this is what did happen. Now let's talk about the one that we weren't sure about, because it talked about the little horn that became exceedingly great. Because sometime later it said a king shall arise. when transgressors have reached their fullness, when Israel had fallen back into sin. So, in this intertestamental period of time, when at the end of the Old Testament, chronologically speaking, what has happened? At the end of the Old Testament, what is happening chronologically speaking? Chronologically speaking, when we talk about things happening in the 400s and in the late 300s, what's happening? I'm sorry, what? They're in captivity? They're returned. They've returned from captivity, the Babylonian captivity now, and what are they doing? Under Ezra, no, we're still in the 400s. Rome's not in existence yet. We have, well, Rome's not in its full power. I don't know if it wasn't fully existent at that point, but they're not the major power. In the 400s, around 408, we understand that the temple had been rededicated. Ezra attempted to rebuild the wall, was unsuccessful, and then who comes and builds it in the mid-400s? Nehemiah comes and rebuilds the wall, and then they're reestablishing basically the Israelite nation in Judaism, right? And so from that point forward, they took the problem that got them into the idolatry and all that stuff, and they started working their way away from those sins that got them into captivity. But there were still things that took place, and still things they were going to be judged for during this intertestamental period. This is what it's talking about here, that the transgressors have reached their fullness when Israel had fallen back into sin. So there would be a time frame when they would get things reestablished. Remember, Haggai and Zechariah had to show up so they would finish the temple. They would go through lulls and stuff, and then they got back going. And so, but they still fell back into sin, and they would be punished for it. Now they'd be punished with mighty power. This is the king that should arise, but not by his own. He shall destroy fearfully, prosper and thrive, and destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper. He'll magnify himself and destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, God himself. Now, he shall be broken without human hand. See, in the last part of 25, it says, but he will be broken without human agency. So, we have some interesting history that almost all scholars are in agreement that this points to one individual, and this is Antiochus Epiphanes, ruler of Syria. So he was from the ones we said there, Seleucus. I think he was the fourth in that line from Syria. And so he was ruler of Syria from 175 to 163 BC. And what had happened, he had gone down to try and capture the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt and got beat down. But he wasn't completely beat down. As he retreated back north, he stopped off in Jerusalem and vented some of his frustration there with about 20,000 of his men. And so, from that point forward, he thought that Jerusalem would be kind of a buffer between him and Rome. That's the way it was, the Roman culture, or Rome. And his idea was to impose Hellenistic culture to the max. So if it agreed with Hellenistic culture, with the culture of the Greeks that began with Alexander the Great, he was going to impose that upon whatever host culture they were, and anything that didn't agree with that was to be removed and destroyed. So he did some incredible things. He imposed Greek culture. Now, backing up to this idea here, well, let me talk about this first, then I'll circle back. So when he conquered Jerusalem, one of the things, he did a lot of terrible things. But on the altar that had been built, they set up an image in the temple, and on the altar they offered swine flesh upon the altar, encouraged Greek soldiers to commit fornication in the temple, and they forbade anything that had to do with Judaism, anything that had to do with that circumcision, keeping the Sabbath. They destroyed the Torah or the Talmud. Anything that had to do with the religion, they destroyed it and removed it from the temple. And so what we find out is that there was what was called a revolution took place. See, he thought they would just, that their religion, that this stuff was just kind of like tokens to them. It was more superstition, and he come to find out that wasn't the case. It was very much the center of their life in general. And so they had a revolution that was called the Maccabean Revolution. And that came to a head, and they were successful. But as you see there, in the Maccabean Revolution, they didn't have to kill Antiochus Epiphanes. He died. Now, what happened to him? This is an interesting description. There's two different historical accounts that are looked to. There's two different ancient sources that differ in the details. And there's writings called 1 Maccabees 6:4 and 8:16 says that after he attempted to raid a temple at Elamias, he withdrew to Babylon. There he became deathly ill after hearing of the victories of Judas Maccabee. He died many days later. So that was one way that it was put. The second way that history records states that Antiochus attempted to raid a temple in Persepolis rather than Elamias. There he heard disturbing news of the Maccabean victories, and as he was uttering dire threats of reprisal against the Jews, he was seized with severe abdominal pains. He fell out of his chair and thereby sustained severe injuries. An attack of worms on his bowels was accompanied by a revolting stench. Antiochus finally died with petitions on his lips for mercy from the God of Israel. That's from Josephus. Josephus actually presents a blend of these two accounts from the books of Maccabees. So, it didn't end well for him. Now, just to show you, so when they set up an image of the temple and we talk about Hellenistic culture, what image do you think it was? And if you already know, be quiet. They know this stuff. Anybody? So Hellenistic culture, they set up an image in the temple. What do you think it was? No. Zeus. Yeah, it was Zeus. Now, here's something also tied to this. Talking about back here, magnify his own power and magnify himself in his own heart, and he will even oppose the prince of princes. His coins read this, Theos Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. So his image with God manifest. So he believed he was, I think at one point too, he was called Zeus Epiphanes or something. He incorporated Zeus into his name. So he was taken on, he believed he was a deity. So now, that's how he died. He was broken without human hand, but God should destroy him. And he had worms. So, the vision of the evenings and mornings. Now, remember this? The vision of the evenings and mornings. The number of days and the number of days the sacrifices will cease and the temple desolated. So, this was the time frame. So, we determined that there were different things there that was possibilities, to different ways that the scholars look at it. Maybe it was a literal period, a little over 6 years, corresponding to the actual period of the time of the abomination by Antiochus Epiphanes occurred from 171 to 165. And so that is one view. Let me look again and see what the other possibility was, because it had to do with the 3.5. Yeah. So the time of his power from the persecution by Antiochus began in 171 and went to 163, so a little over 6 years in that time span. But also the desecration of the temple was specifically from 168 to 165, so it spanned about 3.5 years. So depending on which way you look at it, either one could be right. In fact, maybe they both are. From the time that he started his persecution in general, but then the actual desecration of the temple to the cleansing of the temple was that 3.5 years. So we could be either way here. Now, Daniel instructed to seal up the vision, for it was to occur many days in the future, almost 400 years later. And the effect upon Daniel, he fainted and was sick for days. Though he afterward arose and went to the king's business, he was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. So he never really had any clear answers of the thing as a whole. Now the vision is probably the easiest to understand of the 4 visions that Daniel saw. So of the first one, I think we made some good headway on that. The second one, the same thing. The third one, which we're going to start in tonight, it's tough. And so we're going to have to really see what we can figure out. Now, the identity of the ram and the goat are clearly given. History confirms what is described in this vision. The conflict between Medo-Persia and Greece, the division of the Grecian Empire following Alexander's death, the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, and the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. So, the purpose of this vision was to prepare the people of Daniel for what was to come, the time of the end, and in the latter time of indignation, the persecution that would come upon Israel toward the end of the Old Testament period during the intertestamental period. See, this time frame around 170, 160 was kind of the beginning of the end. Okay? Because within a couple hundred years, what's going to take place? So Greece, and then the Greeks breaking up into the 4 kingdoms who weren't as powerful as they were when they were united under Alexander. Now something's going to happen. What's going to happen? Okay, but from the 4 Greek kingdoms, what's going to happen? Greek kingdoms. Who's going to rise to power and overthrow the Greeks? Rome. So Rome's going to rise. So Rome is rising. The Greeks falling away. And then we know in 70 AD would be the time of the end for Judaism. Now the remarkable accuracy of this vision has led some to date the book of Daniel after the events of Antiochus Epiphanes. So that would be skeptics, the ones that said that this can't be. They break it up into different time frames written by different Daniel. Same thing they do with Isaiah, because it's so accurate. So the way that we look at what happens in the book of Isaiah with its prophecies, we should be struck with awe at what's happening here with these, because it's remarkable in its accuracy. But its accuracy poses no problem for those who accept the inspiration of the Scriptures, and should remind us of God's power to fulfill His Word. Now there's 3 scriptures there that talk about that. Now let's talk about let's read the last one. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it. I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it. I will also do it. And so those things that are in Isaiah 46 are the things, the time frames that we're reading about and studying about here that's involved with Daniel as well. So now let's turn our attention. Any questions about chapter 8? Let's turn our attention to chapter 9. So chapter 9 begins with Daniel's prayer for his people, and we're not going to look at that because it's not necessarily prophetic. It's pretty self-explanatory in what he's praying. It brings in some historical aspects about what Daniel knew. but it definitely illustrates to us that Daniel was indeed a man of prayer and trusted and had faith in God. So, in verse 20 is where we're going to begin. Verses 20 through 27 are some of the most challenging verses in all the Bible. So let's see. We now come to one of the most difficult passages, commonly called the vision of the 70 weeks. Edward J. Young describes it as one of the most difficult in all the Old Testament, and the interpretations which have been offered are almost legion. Now, is that 1,000? Is that what that number represents? Legion, 1,000? Yeah. Stewart says that it would require a volume of considerable magnitude even to give a history of the ever-varying and contradictory opinions that have been offered. Now, before we get any further into this, we have to understand right from the bat one of the primary reasons that this is one of the more difficult passages, and understand what perspectives could be right and which ones there's just no way they could be right. Okay, so what happens is there is a group out there that tries to reconcile Revelation with Daniel. Right? We've talked about this. They try to say that the things that we're reading about here in Daniel actually tie directly to the things of Revelation, in that they even now have not occurred. Okay, the primary group we've called is dispensationalists, and then premillennial dispensationalists in particular. And so what happens is they take especially this vision of the weeks and the things that's said here, and they try to incorporate it again with the Antichrist, right? With the rise of the Antichrist in the book of Revelation, because the Antichrist is mentioned in Revelation, right? It's not. They try to say that this Antichrist rises to power, and then this is what it's talking about here in Daniel chapter 9. And so we reject that proposition from the get-go. And it's basically, in my opinion, really trying to pound a round peg into a square hole. But they can make it work with enough hammering in the way that they try to say these things. So keep that in mind, that what they try to do is, that's where there is so much. Now, even amongst those who don't do that, there's still some differing, because you'll see. And that's the part that like I said, I was really working hard, smoke coming out my ears trying to figure it out. So, with such a difficult passage before us, we should approach it with humility and not dogmatically, and not draw conclusions that would contradict clear teachings of Scripture. So, the ones that place the 70 weeks in the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, right? Because in the book of Hebrews, it said that Jesus came to fulfill the prophets, right? Right? Did that include John the Revelator? When he said that, it's primarily pertaining to what? Yeah, all the things that were bound up in the law and the prophets of the Old Testament. John had not spoken yet. Right? Now, ultimately, will the things of Jesus culminate? Is he kind of tied to what happens in Revelation? Yes. But one of the most important things, and this is one of the most beautiful things that I ever saw, was when Johnny Presley was teaching out of the book of Zechariah? Zephaniah? What book was it? I don't want to sound ignorant. But when he did that, he made the statement that we always interpret in light of the Old Testament prophecies always point directly towards the first coming of Jesus, not the second. So that is the key dynamic that we must keep in our mind here, is that these pertain to the first coming of Jesus, not the second. And so if we try to say that these things pertain to the second, you got to do some real tap dances. And have you guys ever seen the TV preachers with the big charts and the things and their maps everywhere, and they've got the timelines drawn out, and almost always it's bound up in this stuff in Daniel. Which part? Oh. Okay, what we're seeing here in this Old Testament prophecy will be fulfilled in the first coming of Jesus, not the second. If we try to take this stuff in Daniel and apply it to his second coming, then that's where we get into the dispensationalist, the viewpoints of things that this. Okay, so when we get into the 70 weeks or the 77s, they try to say that last week is the one that happens in the tribulation. You guys remember the tribulation? Is it 7 years? Was it 7 years? 3.5 tribulation, right? They try to take that and say this has to do with the second coming and the rapture and all that stuff. That has nothing to do with this. Now, that being said, there are different views that we're going to look at that lock this in still to the first coming of Jesus, but there's varying ways to try to understand it. Does that make sense? And so we got to try to figure out which one. So we reject the ones that place it in the second coming. We accept the ones that place it in the first coming, and we try to figure out which one is most accurate. So let's dig in with that being said. So we begin with verse 20. And so let's read the first 3 verses, or the 4 verses here. Now while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord, my God, in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. And he gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued. Now remember, we talked about this in one of the sermons. Now, again, I think this is incredible. So Daniel begins his prayer time, and at the beginning of his prayer time, God gives him the command, go, to Daniel. I think that's pretty awesome. And I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. Okay, so now that's just setting things up. That's just what was going on and all that kind of stuff there at the time of the evening offering, and to give Daniel skill to understand. And so those things are listed there on page 1. Now let's go to page 2, the vision of the 70 weeks. Now we're going to dig into this as much as we can and see if we can figure some stuff out. But we're not going to obviously get through the entirety of this lesson, but we're going to get into a good portion of it. So we have a general statement of what's to occur. So let's look at the proclamation here that's made, the vision. It said 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince. So the time frame there, right, is from the issue of a decree until Messiah the Prince. There will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with the plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even unto a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay. So 70 weeks. 70 weeks are determined for Daniel's people. Now, I want you to go ahead and flip to the last page of your lesson. And guess what? I don't even have it. You have it, but I don't. Looks like this. Now, that being said, you see two names here, Dr. James Smith and George Fall, who most of you know that George passed away this morning. Yep. It was really quite beautiful what Kendall had written, and I wish I could remember the exact words, but it had the background of happy smiley faces. Good news is how he started off, in all caps with exclamation points. Yeah, the angels had come to Summit Theological Seminary and had come to get George, and that is biblical, the way that he wrote there. And so it was very much an encouragement. So a lot of what I've been digging in are George's materials, as we all have. I doubt there's anybody here that hasn't studied some of George Fall's stuff, so we are blessed by that tonight. And also blessed by Dr. James Smith, and that's where we're getting most of our stuff here, but we've got some timelines here. So to kind of give us just a little bit of understanding, you see how it's laid out here, and there's three different views that are much the same, but they're different. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So if you have the ability to keep that handy as we talk, that'd be great. Kelly, did you tell him Monday they'd already made arrangements? What? 10 to 1 was the visitation and 1 was the funeral. So anybody want to talk to me about possibly going for that? Get with me after tonight, and we'll see what we can work out, because it's something that we had already talked about. Kelly and I talked about that if possible, we wanted to go, so pay our respects. Okay, so that being said, let's get into this. So when we talk about weeks, it says 70 weeks are determined for Daniel's people, Israel, and his holy city, Jerusalem. So if you look there in verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. Gabriel's talking to who? Who's his people? Right. And your holy city, right, which would be Jerusalem. So now, where are we at in the timeline here? So what had happened with Babylon? They came in and eventually destroyed the temple and took captives. Daniel's in captivity. He's near the end of his captivity here. Near the end of the captivity, and it's soon the temple's going to be rebuilt. So he's looking forward to the temple being rebuilt. But then we see some other things here that, if you notice, there were some things that weren't going to be good. Desolations and indignations. Well, we've already been through that. I'm sure he's thinking. Well, what's he talking about? What's he thinking about? Now, so this is taking place near the end of the captivity. When this is taking place, just so you can kind of know where Daniel is at in his timeline, and also what he's going to be thinking about this. So the word weeks in Hebrew is actually 7. So it literally means 7 sevens. Most agree it refers to weeks, but weeks of what? Weeks of days? If it was weeks of days, then it would be 490 days. If you believe this is the case, and so most all figuritize this passage to some extent. So it's not literal weeks. What about weeks of years? Each day representing a year. Then it would be 490 years. Now, there gets into some debate now. This is where it all starts getting a little hard to wrap our heads around it. They talk about solar years and lunar years. You guys ever heard this discussed? So this is where we get into things like leap years and the Jewish calendar and how this all worked. But when we talk about this, so the Jews used a lunar calendar, 360 days a year, so it would be 483 years according to our calendar. Many suggest this to be the answer, but it is not without difficulty. And then there's others who say that these 70 weeks, these 77s, to be representative of a non-specific period of time. So a complete yet non-specific set of time. Now, we've come across those concepts before when we've studied apocalyptic language, right? That numbers are representatives of sets of complete time, but it's not representative of actual years. Like the millennium, right? The 1,000 years. Is it a literal 1,000 years? No, right? I was going to say, no, tell me you remember that, right? It's representative of a complete yet non-specific set of time, right? So we quantify that as the church age. So some say that with these numbers. Well, what we're going to see here is that this passage actually leans to a literal interpretation rather than figurative. Figurative meaning that it's non-specific. So the weeks, it's a little hard to understand. It's figurative, but not completely figurative. It's figurative / literal. Because 70 weeks, then it would have to be, but the weeks are representative, but the 70, they believe, is literal. Are you with me? Yep? Okay. All right. So let's look here. Okay, so there's arguments for this being these literal number of years. So weeks of years and not days is the consensus among scholars of all prophetic schools. The alternative is to take the heptad. So you see the word heptad, that's a one of the sevens, or the weeks. Okay, they call it a heptad. It has already weeks of days. We've already said that we're rolling out ordinary 7-day weeks. So what are the supporting arguments? There are at least 3 good reasons for understanding the 70 weeks as 490 years arithmetic. How do you say that? According to math. All right. Arithmetically. 490 years according to math. First, that's hard to say, arithmetically. It sounds funny too. First Daniel 9 is generally literal. It does not contain the imagery of the earlier visions. Did you notice here that this is Gabriel telling him this? It's not some vision of a two-headed this, that, or the other, or a lopsided bear. This is Gabriel telling him this. It's different, right? Okay, it does not contain the imagery of the earlier visions. Second, the passage is related to Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years. So when we talk about Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years, what's Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years referring to? The captivity, the length of the Babylonian captivity. So Jeremiah prophesied that the Babylonian captivity that would go into the Persian captivity would last 70 years. So it's correlated to that. Third, a literal interpretation of the 70 hetads, 490 years, fits the facts of history. So we can look back and see that this does work. Now there's other arguments supporting the heptad week 7 years interpretation. Now this was really cool. All right, so when we talk about a time frame in Western culture, how do we quantify it if we want to talk about a certain date or a certain time frame in our culture? We'll say that it happened in could go by centuries, but if it's more recent. Yeah, okay. So we might say, oh yeah, the 80s. Right? So when we say the 80s, you know what we think about, right? Well, that's not how they thought. They actually quantified their time when they spoke of periods of years according to sevens. A group of 7 years according to the year of Jubilee. So when they referenced the 7-year time frame, it was like we talk about the 80s or 90s. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, just as Westerners think in terms of units of 10 years, the Israelites divided time into 7-year units that terminated in the sabbatical rest for the land. Daniel knew that Babylonian captivity had been based on violation of the divine law of the sabbatical year. So, that was part of their punishment, is they weren't following the sabbatical years. Post-biblical usage on the part of the Jews may be cited in favor of the meaning of weeks of years. It should be noted, however, that the book of Jubilees and Mishnah were written centuries after Daniel. So, an explanation of 70 times 7 equals 490 years has its roots in Leviticus, which threatens a 7-fold punishment for disobedience. The 70 years of exile and punishment would be multiplied 7-fold. The expression 3 sevens of days occurs 3 full weeks. That's in Leviticus. The addition of days sets these sevens apart from those in chapter 9. The implication is that the sevens in chapter 9 are not regular weeks of days. Now, so, that's what we're talking about, is when we see the 77s, it's representative of a 490-year period of time. Now, this period of time will be for the fulfillment of 6 things. Now, remember our number one axiom or truth that we're hanging on to as we interpret this, which is that it's interpreted in light of what? First coming of Christ. Okay, so if we're thinking of the first coming of Christ, now let's focus in on verse 20, back in 24. So 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now I'm going to give you a little heads up. How many of you have that verse 24, ending with the word holy? Okay, you guys have it ending with the most holy. King James? New King James? NIV. Okay? So theirs ends with most holy. Yours ends a place. Anything interesting about the word place in yours? It's italicized. And why would that be? Just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Now, a lot of you carry the same Bible I do. Right? It's the Keyword Study Bible. I'm going to tell you something here that may bother you a little bit. So my Greek teacher told me, all interpretation is tied to presupposition. All interpretation is tied to what you already think and know. There's no such thing as an unbiased interpretation. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that can't be. But have we ever seen evidence of biased interpretation? What's the most prominent thing we talk about in the Christian church is a biased interpretation when we talk about, or translation. Translation. Yeah, that's what you said too, right? Yeah, when we talk about that, right? We talk about translation. No such thing as a unbiased translation. He said that all translations have bias in them. Just some have more than others. So we have to be careful. And sometimes when editors have a theological bent, then they need it to say something. That is happening here at the end of this verse. Now, at least they're being somewhat honest in that they've italicized it. They've italicized it because the word place does not occur in the Greek in any way. They've added it because they feel that's the best interpretation of it, of that translation. You'll see why here in a minute. If it says most holy, but if it says most holy place, then are you locked in? Which one's more specific? Place. Right? So if it's place, then your mind is automatically taken to what? The Holy of Holies, right? So let's see what fits. Let's see what... Keep that in mind. So, there's 6 things that are going to happen here. And 6 things that are going to happen during this time period. 6 things are going to be fulfilled. Now, our author here has apparently related to the work of the coming Messiah. I would even remove apparently and say that they are related to the coming work of the Messiah. Now, the first 2 are a little tricky. The next 4 are much easier, I believe. The first 2 are a little tricky because the wording and it can be a little confusing. So, the first one, it says, to finish the transgression. What does that mean? To cover it? Okay, now just finish. I got to kind of come at you here a little bit. Finish here does have nothing to do with covering. End it? Stop it? Okay, so have we ever seen a time period where there was no sin? So what's this mean? So this is a little tricky. Right? Okay. All right, did I see any other hands? I think somebody might have been scratching and I saw the hand go down. So I want to make sure I don't want to cut anybody off. Okay, so we got to make sure that we're thinking in that context that Gary's saying here is what's taking place. So the marginal reading has restrain for finish. Now this is the idea that the Messiah would provide a restraining power and influence would check the progress of sin. That's one way to look at this. So Albert Barnes in his commentary. Now Barnes, when he looks at the end times, is amillennial. So we're okay with that. We're okay with an amillennial view of things. When we get into the premillennial and the dispensationalists, that's where things get wacky. Now, that doesn't mean we agree with everything that Barnes says. Okay? But when it comes to this, now, I think the way that Doc Smith explains this makes more sense. So when we talk about, when you think of the relationship of Jesus himself to finish the transgression, the idea here is these 2 things, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, is this idea of God dealing with sin. God opposes the Jewish leaders, placing a limit upon their sin and then sentencing it. So it's like saying that it's limited to this period of time, and then after that period of time you've done so much, you're going to be sentenced. And so, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. So, it's this idea of the restraining presence of Jesus in Jerusalem. Or the restraining power of the gospel. And this idea of to make an end of sins was that Israel's sins were being sealed and reserved for punishment. Now, when we understand at the conclusion of this time period, if it does in fact conclude with the Messiah, then we say that something's going to happen in relationship to the Messiah that's going to deserve punishment. Okay, yeah, the crucifixion, right? Was Jerusalem held, were Jews and the Jewish leaders held responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus? So this idea of God opposing the Jewish leaders and placing a limit upon their sin and then sentencing it. To make an end of sins and to finish the transgression. Those are the 2 that I think are the hardest to kind of wrap our minds around it. But I think Doc Smith really gives us a good picture here. Now, yeah, it's not just, it is finished. Could it mean more than just that could it mean that it's a proclamation of judgment against them? Well, wow, could be. Yep. Okay. Yeah, we're going to get to that. So that actually takes place here on the next two. So typically commentators divide these 6 into 2 3s. Smith divides them up into 3 2s. So the first 2 are together, then the next 2 are together. And the next 2 would be to make atonement for iniquity. So that's what you're thinking, right, Larry? And to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, what were these things accomplished in the first coming of Jesus Christ? One of them. Okay, so both of these, in fact, all 4 so far, are able to be under the umbrella of the first coming of Christ. There's nothing here that pushes us to the end of time, right? Okay. So, to bring in everlasting righteousness, literally to cause to come, or let's back up, to make reconciliation for iniquity, literally to cover iniquity. See, this one does have to do with covering iniquity. And that's the way the Greek really reads here. How this would be done is not stated here, but if you go to Isaiah, we can talk about how the iniquity of us all was placed upon him, right? So, to bring in everlasting righteousness, literally, to cause to come, to provide a way by which a man could become righteous and holy. Did Jesus, in what he did in his first coming, provide a way for where a man could become righteous and holy? Absolutely. Now, to seal up vision and prophecy, to complete, to finish, meaning the prophecies would be fulfilled. Right? Did Jesus say anything about this? Yeah, listen to this. This word in the Greek, seal up, and this idea here has to do with like sealing up something that has been authenticated. Has to do with the idea of authentication. Now think about this in his first coming and then talking about visions and prophecy and how they're tied to the authentication of Jesus. If I can get to the right page here. Okay. Old Testament Messianic prophecy was authenticated in a unique way by the life, the death, the resurrection, and ascension of Christ. It was also authenticated by supernatural gifts that accompanied the preaching of the gospel in the earliest days of the church. Payne thinks Jesus may have been elaborating on this phrase in Luke 18:21. He points also to John 3:33. The man who accepts the testimony of Jesus has certified, literally sealed, that God is truthful. So Daniel is predicting that messianic prophecy will be confirmed within the parameters of the 70 heptads. So this idea here where it says to seal up the vision and prophecy is saying that through the life, the death, the burial, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus Christ, and those who were empowered after him to bring in and usher the church, was authentication of the Old Testament prophecies and thus sealed them. That's pretty cool, right? So right now we've got those 5 things that take us in the first coming of Jesus. Do we have any issue with any of these so far correlating to the first coming of Jesus? All right, now we come to that verse, that word, where yours might say place. So, if you hold to a dispensational premillennial view, you want something to happen in regarding the temple. What is it? If you're a premillennial dispensationalist, you want something to happen to the temple. You want it to be rebuilt and restored to its glory, right? Right? And so that the most holy place but this word is not referring to a place, it's referring to a person. The most holy is Jesus. So the idea here of what's going to be happening, and it's going to conclude with the most holy and him being anointed.
But really, holy needs to be capitalized, like you said, the place needs to be marked out. Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. You go right ahead, because this is talking about the person, not the place. Now, I actually have that already done in mind. And that correlates to Luke 4:34. When the demon said, "We know who you are the Holy One of God, the Most Holy." Right? Now, was the Most Holy anointed? When? At his baptism. So we look for the conclusion of the 69th week to be his baptism, his anointing, his immersion, the inauguration of his messianic work. Now, if you look here on these charts, you can study these and start to get acquainted with them, and I want you to find the differences. That's your homework. What are the differences? So, I want you to think of this like a treasure map. Okay? I want you to think of this of a treasure map. And on the map, it's a picture of an island. And here's what you have. You've got all these different places on the island, trees and alcoves and big rocks and formations and stuff. And at the bottom it says, take 22 steps east, 42 steps west, 10 paces south, da-da-da-da-da. That's the instructions that you have. There's one valuable piece of information missing, though, on the map. Where do you start? So, when we correlate that to the 70 weeks, the 77s, the 70 heptads, we have to know, where does it begin? Because if you say it begins here, then it's going to end. The starting point here is crucial. And this is where all the variances lie. The starting point. Maybe we do. Well, why don't you could do that then. So then you have to figure out chronologically, if we are saying that the anointing of the Most Holy was his baptism, at the end of then you got to work backwards from there, then you have to know what? If we're trying to figure out, you got to know when it was. Now, off the top of your head, give me a number when you think Jesus was baptized. The date, the year. 26 to 28? Because you guys are reading that. You dirty cheaters. Oh, okay. What are you basing that on? But you need to know too, well, wait a minute. Jesus had how long a ministry? 3 years. 3.5, right? So if it was 26-ish, then that puts him crucified at when? 30-ish. Well, wait a minute. Jesus was how old? 33. BCAD is 0. That means he was born before 0? Yes, you can work backwards. You just have to figure some stuff out. All right. Is your brain smoking? You see why mine has been? This is. Hopefully when we're done, you'll be like, okay, I can see it. Does it? Well, that's tricky. That's tricky. There's a 2020 version of that? Really? I didn't know that. Guess those guys in got in captivity during quarantine and is place still italicized? Oh, dirty rotten. Most holy place says place. Is it place italicized? See, that's what I'm saying. Some are more honest than others. But in the Greek, it's most holy. They've added place because they believe that to clarify and help you understand. That's an interpretation. It's a translation and an interpretation all at the same time. Okay, the differences in these three charts that I've given you. So the top one is Doc Smith's view. So look for differences. And then the two at the bottom, they're very much look for similarities, but also look for the differences and see if you can try to understand them. He presented two. He had like 11 of the different views that are out there. And the different, well, I'm exaggerating, I think there was maybe 6 or 7. But the one that's at the bottom is what's called the traditional view. Traditional view, and then George's view that he called the correct view. And then, that just wasn't like him at all. And then Doc Smith's view. And I would love to have sat there and listened to those two, because they're all three the same, but they get to that same X marks the spot in different ways. And trying to figure out which one's right, when you start digging in the history, it's like,